we doing? We doing good? Good. All right, well, thank you, Nick, for reading. If y'all haven't turned yet, go ahead and turn to Daniel 1. And as Nick said, we'll be in verses 8 through 16. Last week, we kicked off this new Daniel series where we're just going verse by verse, expository teaching. And last week, our big message was on identity. In verses 1 through 7, we learned how Daniel and his friends, even though they were removed from their city, their friends and family were killed, their names were even changed, they were able to triumph and stand through it all because they knew what their identity was. And that is, they are children of God, which is the same identity that we have here in 2021 America. And that's really powerful. I have a question tonight, and that's this: will you take a stand? Will you take a stand? Because see, some of you are going to be confronted over your faith. And most of you probably already have at some point in your life. People have challenged you, they've mocked you, they've ridiculed you because they know you're a Christian. And it's really no surprise when you turn on the news and you look at the way that our country is heading, whether it's the socio-political nature of everything. I mean, it is not popular to be a Christian right now. And there are things that we're seeing today that 10 to 15 years ago we probably would have thought was crazy, and we're seeing it. So I only wonder, what are we going to see in the next 10 to 15 years? I mean, I'm not here to prescribe anything, but I wonder if our children are going to be denied from public universities because of their faith. Because if the country continues to condemn Christianity in this realm of quote-unquote hate speech and intolerance, will public universities eventually accept Christians? I think that's a good question that we need to ask ourselves. I mean, right now, the churches are under attack in terms of tax-exempt status. We talk about it as a staff. But I don't think the side that's opposing churches would just stop once tax-exempt status is removed. I wonder if after that, maybe a bump in taxation would happen. And then would that trickle down to individuals who are Christians too? Would we see an increase in taxes? It sounds crazy, but we're going to need to take a stand. And all this is like in the ether. It's just theoretical. It's not personal, but I want y'all to think of some examples that may be personal to you where you've had to take a stand for your faith. Let me give you an example. Let's say you take a girls' trip out of town, and you're all sitting around a bonfire, and one of the girls says, "Hey, after this trip, just so you guys know, I'm pregnant. I'm going to have an abortion." And so she asks all the girls sitting around the fire, "What do y'all think?" And one by one, they say things like, "Yeah, do it. You don't need the stress of a baby. Go for it. It's your right." And then it comes to you. Are you going to stand up for what you believe in? Are you going to risk losing your friends in that moment? I mean, all of us are going to sit here and say, "Yeah, absolutely, I would stand up." But in that moment, would you? I graduated from Virginia Tech in 2017. Go Hokies. And who said it? Let's go. Go Hokies. And I met a girl there. She was raised in a Muslim household. And her senior year of high school, she started going to Young Life, and she met Jesus, and she just fell in love with him. And day by day, week by week, she just became on fire for the Lord. And so one day she came home from school. It's still first semester of senior year. And she discovered in her bedroom that her dad had found the Bible that she was hiding and all of her notes, and had just ripped them to shreds. And when she turned around, he was standing there, and he said, "Okay, you can either continue to worship Jesus, but you're going to leave. You're no longer welcome in my house. Or you can reject him, and then we'll continue to keep you as our daughter." So she chose the first option. She chose to worship Jesus and move out of her parents' home. And she couch surfed and lived with different families for the whole second semester of her high school senior year and that summer. And then when she got to Tech, she realized that none of her payments had gone through because her parents decided to no longer pay for her school, even though they'd promised her forever. I mean, she was under the assumption that her school was going to be paid for when she got there. So she got a full-time job, was a full-time student, and still joined a campus ministry, and she was crushing it. And I always ask myself, man, if my parents were going to kick me out of the house for what I believed in, would I have taken that stand? And I'll give you all another example at the end of the night, but that's really the question tonight, right? Will you take a stand? So to recap a little bit from last week, Daniel and his friends are taken captive to Babylon to enter a period of training to serve the king. So in Daniel 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved, which really means just set his heart, which is a very intentional act. Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. All right, so I'm a very visual person. Guys, when I read the Bible, I got to put myself in the story. I basically just turn it into a movie in my head. So if you'll just entertain this thought. We're all going to enter the story here. Let's say we're some of the young people that have been taken captive by the Babylonians, and we're being led away from Jerusalem, and we turn around, and the whole city behind us is just up in smoke, and we hear screams of people slowly dying. We see just bodies strung out all across the street of our friends and family. We're scared. We have no idea what's awaiting us. Our names have been changed. We're going to be forced to get, a different language, a different education, and ultimately the Babylonians are going to force us to serve a different God, at least they think. But in the midst of it all, we haven't even eaten. I don't think your city can be under attack and your first thought is, all right, I need to get some food. So all day you haven't eaten, and probably the whole journey you haven't eaten either. It's roughly 500 miles between Jerusalem and Babylon. So if you're walking at a brisk speed, you're probably walking at 4 miles an hour. So if you're walking 4 miles an hour and Babylon is 500 miles away, how many hours would that take to get there? Any math people in the room? Well, yeah, a lot. 125 hours. That's how long it would take to walk from Jerusalem to Babylon. How many days is 125 hours? Anybody? It's more than 4. It's 5. Well, it's 5.2083 and then 3 repeating, but point is, it's well over 5 days, and that's if you walk nonstop. So when you add in rest breaks and time to sleep, it's probably a 9 or 10-day journey. They're going to be royal servants, but the key word there is servant. So if they're hungry, these guys don't care. If they die of starvation on the way, no big deal, because they're replaceable. They're just going to be servants. So we're on the way to Babylon. We're starving. It's like the hungriest you've ever been in your life. And you get to Babylon, and you enter the king's court, and you just see table after table after table. They stretch the entire length of the room covered in food. And you're like, yes, finally, here we go. And you're about to run and get the food, and then someone's arm sticks out and stops you. And you look to your side, and it's Daniel. You're like, what are you doing? We're starving. Let's go eat this food. Daniel takes a stand. He's like, no, we're not going to eat this food. The educated Jews in those times would have known old Mosaic law. They would have known Leviticus 11, which explicitly states what is clean and unclean. And two of the big food staples in Babylonian culture, which was horse meat and pork, were the two things in Leviticus of many that were considered unclean. So if they're going to adhere to God's law, they can't eat this food. Daniel takes a stand. But that's probably not the primary reason why Daniel isn't going to eat this food, why Daniel and his friends agree not to eat this food, because, going back to Leviticus 11, there's nothing in there prohibiting the drinking of wine in this context, and they decide that they're not going to drink the king's wine. So there's a bigger issue at play. See, he probably refused to eat the food and drink the wine because in doing so, he's pledging allegiance to the king. And effectively, he's saying, we depend on you to live by eating your food. If you're going to provide us the food, then we depend on you to live. And he's not going to do that because the only one that they're going to bow down to is the one true God. So they ask for permission to not eat the food. Let's go to verse 9. Now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. All right, so Daniel still has his head. He's already spoken out against the king, which you don't want to do. I mean, he just watched the guy kill his friends and family and burn out his city. So that must have taken some guts. He speaks out against the king. He still has his head. Why? Because God is protecting him. It says very clearly right there. God honors Daniel's obedience, and we know that God honors our obedience today by protecting us. That doesn't mean life is going to be safe. God does not call us to a safe life. We need to make that very clear. A lot of people looking at it from the outside in think Christianity is just rainbows and butterflies and everyone's all happy all the time. As we know, that's not the case. Christianity is dangerous. It's not a call to live safely, but God is good and he does honor obedience. And that's exactly what he's doing right here with Daniel and his friends. Verse 10. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, King Nebuchadnezzar. I'm afraid of my lord the king who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. I think this verse is really sad because we learn in this verse that the other men have given in. They've conformed. They've decided to eat the food. They've decided to honor the king. And we don't even know their names, right? We know Daniel, we know Hananiah, we know Mishael, we know Azariah, but no one else. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that the reason we know these names is because they're the only ones that stayed faithful among all the captives. And in the scriptures, their names are recorded forever, for all of history. But I guess we need to just ask ourselves in this story, who would we be? Would we be a fifth name in that list? Or would we be one of the unnamed people that just fade off into obscurity, most likely converted to Babylonian religion and died as rebels to the Lord? Who would we be in this moment? And what about today, when people think of you, when people hear your name, what do they think? Just like going back to that last week when we talked about identity, when people hear your name, just ask yourself right now, when people hear my name, am I somebody who just worships money or clothes or cars or my job or my social circle or hobbies, my sports team? And all those are fine things, but they're vapors just like your life. And if you're not careful, you're going to have misplaced priorities that are going to fade away, and you will have wasted this life that God gave you. And I don't want any of us to be in that boat. Will you take a stand? We go back to the question, will you take a stand? Verses 11 through 14. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. This is Daniel asking the guard. "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. And treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. You guys, I love reading the book of Daniel. It's one of my favorites. I mean, this book had been on my heart for a long time as we kind of figured out where we were going to go, what direction we were going to preach. Like, God laid Daniel on my heart quite a while ago, and I love reading it, but I'm so convicted when I read it. And I'm so humbled because I can't relate to Daniel's unwavering faith. I want to. I want to be a Daniel, but I can't. When I read scripture, I prefer to read about David, you know? A guy who, yes, he was on fire for the Lord, and he was a king, but you can't think about Daniel and not think about his mistakes either. Those mistakes didn't define him, but they're a huge part of his life, like me. I relate to that. I know a lot of us relate better to David than we do Daniel. I prefer to read about Job, a guy who just dealt with tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and his response was to question God and ask God, why? God, how could you do this? I do the same when tragedy hits. I wish I was like Daniel, but I'm not. I prefer to read about Jonah, you know, a guy who was given a task by God, a dangerous mission to go to a dangerous land, to reach a dangerous people, and he fled. He was fearful. He fled. I'm more like Jonah. It's just me being honest. It's me being transparent. I have a hard time relating to Daniel, but I pray and I hope that as we continue this walk of holiness, pursuing holiness, that we would have a faith that emulates that of Daniel's. I really do, guys. Especially as the world around us continues to be shaped and molded by things that are not Christianity. I'm convicted when I read Daniel. And Daniel and his friends make their stance very clear. They're not going to eat the royal food. In fact, he's asking to be fed vegetables and water. And vegetables in this context really just means grains. So they're asking, feed us a low-calorie diet, something that we're probably going to struggle to survive on. And he's asking this after they've been starving for days, over a week. And then on top of that, they make a deal. He says, compare us to the ones that have been eating this high-calorie food. Look at us, compare us to them. And I wonder, do we do the same thing in our lives? Do we want to be compared? Do we want people to watch us? Or do we just want to be closet Christians? When we go out in public, do we just want to put all of our Christianity behind and keep it private so that nobody can see it? And then when we know we're 100% safe behind locked doors, that's when we pull out our Bible and that's when we become Christians. Is that what we're doing? When we go out in public, are we saying, watch us so that you can watch our God? Ask yourself that. Verses 15 and 16. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. How is that possible? Read those verses again. How is that possible? At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished on their low-calorie diet. They're certainly not getting plates piled full of food. It's like grains and a few vegetables and water, and they look healthier and better nourished than the guys who've probably been sitting around all day eating pork and drinking wine and eating a ton of the food, not just like low-shelf food, the best food for hundreds of miles. It's the king's food. How does that happen? And just so you know, healthier and better nourished doesn't mean here what it means today. Don't think Olympic athlete. Don't think that body. Don't think I don't know why I'm pointing at myself. Don't think pro basketball player. Don't think pro basketball player and think of that kind of body. Don't think Navy SEAL and think of that body. In those days, it really means more overweight. Because in those days, for you to be better nourished, or for you to be healthy, was also synonymous with having money. It meant you had access to food, which is something a lot of people didn't have. You couldn't just run to Kroger in those days and load up on chips and salsa. It was difficult to get food. And I discovered this when I went to Lesotho. In 2018, I took a mission trip to Lesotho. It was me and 7 other people from First Roanoke. And we got there, and I was the only unmarried male on the trip coming from Roanoke to Lesotho. And so we met up with our translators, and one of our translators was also an unmarried male. So just the way it worked, we got to be roommates. Great dude. His name was Tablong, and I miss him every day, and I want to meet up with him again at some point. But now he lives in Kansas City, fun fact. He got married to a missionary. Anyway, we're getting ready for bed. It's my bed on one side of the room and his bed on the other side of the room. And I take off my shirt, and he's like, "Phew, you are fat." And I'm like, oh my gosh. I've been called a lot of things in my life, but no one has ever seriously called me fat. And that was a summer where I was working out pretty good. And I was like, just, what is going on? But then he explained to me, he's like, no, it's not an insult. Because here in Lesotho, when people actually do die of starvation, and you look around and people are like skin and bones walking around, fat just means you're well fed. It's a compliment. It means you have money. It means you have access to food. And I was so humbled. And he continued to say, yeah, so-and-so on your trip, we would consider them fat. And this person, and this person, this person. And when you guys walk around, people are envious of you. Because y'all don't go to bed hungry. You know where your food's coming from. You have an abundance of food. I imagine Daniel and his friends looked like us, but even more overweight, because the ones that they're being compared to are the ones that have sat around and just pigged out. They've probably gotten pretty thick. And Daniel and his friends walk out of where they've been hanging out, just eating these vegetables and water, probably just enormous. And people are like, oh my gosh, that's wild. It's crazy. God gave them more weight and more muscle off that diet to honor himself, to point people to him. It's a miracle. It's a wonder. How does it happen? And the outcome is the guard continued to allow them to eat their vegetables and drink their water, and they took a stand, and people noticed. It might seem trivial to emphasize dietary restrictions, but guys, remember, any act of defiance could lead to death. In that circumstance, they're captives. They're disposable. The other captives reasoned to keep their lives. These guys didn't. It was a big deal. And we've also talked in the series about integrity. Look at the way that Daniel approached these requests. He asked for permission. He didn't stand on a street corner and hold a sign with big words on it or a picture and expect people to worship his God. That's not effective. He knows that. He asks for permission, and then he reasons with the officials. He told them to test him. He showed them respect. We can do the same thing. We don't have to agree with everything our leaders are doing. We can still show a sign of respect, because eventually they're going to be looking at us as Christians saying, wow, these Christians actually have a good point. They're respectful. They're reasoning with us. You can point people to Jesus that way. Daniel kept his life. And eventually some of these officials were led to the Lord. And this isn't a works-based message. Daniel and his friends weren't just checking a box because it was the right thing to do. They knew God. It was an obedience of the heart, not of the works. It was an obedience of the heart. I opened the night giving a few examples of what taking a stand looks like. When I was a kid, I think I was 10 years old, maybe 11, I was in church and the pastor gave this example, and it had just happened previously that week. There was a church in Texas that towards the end of the message, 2 masked gunmen walked in, took over the pulpit, told the pastor to get on his knees. They pointed their guns to the pastor and said to everybody, before we kill the pastor, if anyone in here is a Christian, come kneel next to him and die. If you claim that this Jesus is your Lord, then come die for him. Come kneel beside the pastor. But if you want to save your life, just reject Jesus right now, leave, and you'll be fine. And it was a church of 200 to 300 people. And when all the chaos and commotion had ended, there was 10 people to one side of the pastor and 10 people to the other side of the pastor. 20 people kneeling. And the gunman turned to the pastor and said, all right, look to your left and look to your right. This is the church. And they pulled back their guns and they walked out and left. And that story has haunted me ever since I heard it. Because I asked myself then, and I asked myself now, would I be one of the people that took a stand, or in this case, knelt for Jesus? I mean, still on Sundays, I'll be sitting there in a pew, and the thought hits my mind. And we have a great security team. I'm not insinuating that this could ever happen, but when you turn on the news, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. We like to think the church is safe. The church also has a target. If that were to happen today, would you be willing to take a stand for Jesus? Because, guys, truly, Jesus took a stand for you. When he was confronted with oppressors, he preached in truth and love. When he thought about backing down from his mission, he thought about you. He thought about me. He thought about us. He thought about sinners. And as they nailed him to the cross, he remained steadfast in his commitment to sinners in need of a Savior. Even as he was being crucified, he was asking God to forgive them, for they don't know what they do. He even said in his own words during his ministry, Mark 2:17, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. Guys, Jesus took a stand so that we could too. And I implore you all to do that. I want to enter a moment of prayer right now. And on the pews, there's prayer cards. And as we say every week, but we can't say it enough, we have a faithful prayer ministry. And they're in the room right now. And when you write down those cards and you stick it on the prayer wall to the right or the left, just over the next 3-4 minutes, they're going to collect those prayer cards and pray over them one by one. By name, unless you want it to be anonymous, you don't have to sign it. And they're going to lift those prayers up to the God who listens, to the God who cares. And then those prayers are going to be passed to a whole other prayer team in our church. You're going to have over 100 people praying for you specifically this week. Right now, just write down what the Lord has put on your heart. Maybe you're someone in this room who has considered for a long time what a life with Jesus would mean. What would that look like? And maybe tonight, after hearing this music, after hearing this message, you're thinking, Jesus died for me, and there are these people who are willing to die for him. Maybe I need to ask a few questions. Maybe I need to consider what that looks like. If you want to just ask some questions, if you want to take those next steps, go to the back. At the back doors, Michael Bailey will meet up with you. He's going to escort you to Boxley Chapel. And in Boxley Chapel, Michael Harner will be there to just answer some questions and help you navigate those next steps. Church membership, relationship with Jesus, whatever that looks like for you. Will you take a stand? God, I'm humbled. God, when we read the stories of these heroes in the Bible, I ask myself, why am I not like them? How can I be more like them? How can I be more unwavering in my faith to you? It's convicting, God. But even when we're weak, even when we back down, God, you still love us. How is that possible? Lord Jesus, when you hung on the cross, you knew of every person that would reject you. And you still chose crucifixion. You knew of the times that we would run from you and neglect you and be fearful and shy away and back down and not be public Christians. And God, the word sorry doesn't do it. So we ask for forgiveness that you offer. God, I pray that as we go about the rest of the night and our weeks, that you will put opportunities in front of us to be bold for the gospel, not just so we could feel good about ourselves, but so that you will be honored and people would be led to a life-saving relationship with Jesus that will change their eternity forever, so that one day we may see those people in heaven and it would point back to a night in 2021 that they ran into a Christian. Empowered by the Spirit, God, thank you for this community. Use us. Enable us to be bold. God, help us take a stand because Jesus took a stand for us.